In the final months of World War II, Germany was collapsing. The once mighty Third Reich was being squeezed from both sides. Allied forces advancing from the west and the Soviet army closing in from the east. What had begun as a campaign of conquest had turned into a desperate fight for survival. Entire cities lay in ruins, food was scarce, and millions of civilians were on the move, fleeing a war that had finally reached their doorsteps. In East Prussia, panic had become a way of life. As the Red Army advanced, German propaganda had painted the Soviets as ruthless and merciless, and for many, those fears proved to be true. Stories of revenge, of civilians being killed or assaulted, spread quickly through villages and towns. Families packed whatever they could carry and began the long, freezing journey westward, desperate to escape before the Russians arrived. The only way to safety was across the Baltic Sea. That was the setting for one of the least known but deadliest disasters in human history, the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. The ship had been built nearly a decade earlier, in 1937, as part of the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, a propaganda effort meant to show the supposed generosity of the regime. It was a luxury cruise liner designed for German workers, a floating palace that offered ordinary people a taste of privilege, as long as they were loyal to the party. The ship could carry just under 2,000 passengers and crew, and everything aboard it was designed to reflect equality. Every cabin was the same size and comfort. There were no first-class sections, no social divisions, only the illusion of a unified, prosperous Germany. The ship was named Wilhelm Gustloff, the leader of the Nazi Party's branch in Switzerland, who had been assassinated by a Jewish student in 1936. Hitler himself chose the name, turning Gustloff into a martyr and the ship into a symbol of Nazi pride.
When war broke out in 1939,
luxury cruises became a memory. The Wilhelm Gustloff was repurposed first as a hospital ship, then as a floating barracks for the German Navy's submarine training division. For years, it remained moored in the port of Gotenhofen, now the Polish city of Gdynia.
By early 1945,
as Soviet forces closed in, the ship was pressed into one final duty, not as a warship, but as an evacuation vessel. Operation Hannibal began in January 1945, one of the largest sea evacuations in history. In just a few months, over 2 million people, soldiers, civilians, wounded, and refugees, were transported from the eastern territories back to Germany by sea. The Wilhelm Gustloff was to play a major role in that effort. By the evening of January 30th, the ship's decks were overflowing. Thousands of refugees filled every available space, cabins, corridors, even the swimming pool. Estimates vary, but it's believed that between 9,000 and 10,000 people were on board, 5 times the ship's intended capacity. Mothers with infants, wounded soldiers, teenage girls serving in the Naval Auxiliary, all packed together, cold, hungry, and terrified. At around midday, the Wilhelm Gustloff finally left Gotenhofen, bound for Kiel on Germany's northern coast. The weather was brutal: snow, strong winds, and sub-zero temperatures. For protection, the ship was supposed to be escorted by 2 torpedo boats, but one broke down and the other left to follow a different route. The Gustloff was on its own. As night fell, the officers faced a dangerous choice. They could travel close to the coast, where German minefields made navigation deadly, or head into deeper waters, where Soviet submarines were known to patrol. They chose the open sea, hoping the snow and darkness would hide them. For hours, the ship crept forward in near total darkness, its lights extinguished. Then, around 6 p.m., the captain received a message, or thought he did, warning of nearby minesweepers and instructing him to switch on the navigation lights to avoid collision. Whether the message was real or not, no one knows. But when the Wilhelm Gustloff lit up, it became a beacon in the blackness of the Baltic night. Miles away, the Soviet submarine S-13 spotted it. Its commander, Alexander Marinesko, saw the massive silhouette illuminated against the horizon and prepared to attack. At 9:16 p.m., 4 torpedoes were fired. 3 of them hit their target with devastating precision. The first torpedo hit the crew quarters. The second exploded beneath the swimming pool where dozens of female naval auxiliaries were sleeping. The third tore into the ship's midsection, cutting power instantly. Panic swept through the corridors as lights went out and the ship began to list to port. Thousands were trapped below deck. On the upper levels, crew members tried to lower the lifeboats, but most were frozen solid. The tilt of the ship meant that only a few could be launched at all. Out of 22 lifeboats, fewer than 10 made it into the water. People pushed, screamed, and fought for survival. Some fell from the railings into the sea. Others jumped willingly, knowing the water was nearly freezing. Those who hit the water were doomed. The Baltic Sea that night was below freezing, and hypothermia set in within minutes. Survivors described the sound of thousands of voices screaming, then fading into silence as one by one they succumbed to the cold. Within an hour, the Wilhelm Gustloff was gone, sinking beneath the waves just after 10 p.m. The rescue ships that arrived later that night faced horrifying scenes. Bodies frozen stiff, lifeboats overturned, and the sea covered with debris. Of around 10,000 people aboard, only about 1,000 survived. It was the single greatest loss of life in a shipwreck in human history. More than 6 times as many people died as on the Titanic. Yet for decades, few outside Germany even knew it had happened. Both sides in the war had reasons to stay silent. Nazi Germany, already on the brink of collapse, didn't want to publicize a tragedy that showed its people fleeing in panic. The Soviet Union didn't want to celebrate the deaths of thousands of civilians, most of them women and children. And after the war, Germany itself struggled with how to remember the event. How could a nation responsible for so much suffering mourn its own losses? The Wilhelm Gustloff became a ghost, buried not just under the sea, but under history itself. Today, the wreck lies on the floor of the Baltic, protected as a war grave. Few divers visit it, even fewer speak of it. But the tragedy remains one of the starkest reminders of war's cruelty. That in its final days, as nations collapsed and ideologies crumbled, it was the innocent who paid the ultimate price. The Wilhelm Gustloff was meant to be a symbol of national pride. Instead, it became a floating coffin, carrying the hopes of thousands into the freezing dark. And while the world remembers the Titanic as a story of hubris and heartbreak, the Wilhelm Gustloff endures as something even more haunting. A story almost forgotten, of victims who never had the chance to be remembered.